For the first time in more than 10 years, Israel may not have a prime minister named Benjamin Netanyahu. He has failed to form a coalition government twice this year. The door is now open for his rival, Benny Gants, to lead. But will it be any easier for him to form a government? And how might all this play out? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Benjamin Netanyahu is the longest-serving leader of Israel. He has been prime minister twice, his second stint lasting more than a decade. Some have even called him the magician of Israeli politics. But he's been unable to convince his rivals to join him and form a government. That's after two elections this year failed to produce a clear winner. The prime minister's setback is an opportunity for the leader of the opposition blue and white party, Benny Gants, to form a coalition of his own. But this doesn't mean Netanyahu is out completely. So let's take you through what could happen. Benny Gants will now have 28 days to form a government. He'll have to get at least 61 members of parliament or the Knesset to support his bid for a majority government. If Gants cannot form a government in this time, the president could then invite anyone else in the Knesset to assemble a majority. And if that fails, elections will be initiated automatically, the third vote for Israelis this year. The Blue and White Party says the time for spin is over and it's a time for action. Prime Minister Netanyahu has blamed the party's leader for his failure to form a unity government.
In the past weeks, I made every effort to bring Benny Gants to the negotiating table, every effort to establish a broad national government, every effort to avoid another election. To my sorrow, he simply refused time and again. If Gants will come to his senses and free himself from the grasp of Lapid and Lieberman, if he will abandon the idea of a minority government, together we will be able to form the government that the state of Israel needs so much at this time.
We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, Harry Fawcett has this update from West Jerusalem.
No doubt this is a big moment in Israeli politics, the first time in more than a decade that anyone other than Benjamin Netanyahu is set to be given the opportunity to try to form a coalition government. Benny Gants, when asked about his prospects on Tuesday morning, said he was optimistic, but added that optimism was a way of life for him, perhaps a recognition of the scale of the task confronting him, by most measures even more difficult than that which confronted Benjamin Netanyahu, whose efforts ended in failure on Monday. There seem to be two avenues potentially open to Benny Gants and his blue and white party: forming a minority administration with the assistance of the mainly Palestinian Israeli joint list members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, from the outside, but selling that to his own party, and even more importantly to the right-wing party led by Avigdor Lieberman, seems pretty unlikely. Just as unlikely trying to get Likud, the ruling party, to jettison, at least at this stage, its leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. So that would seem to rule out the prospects of a national unity government between the two biggest parties. So if Gantz does fail after his stint at trying to get a government together, then we're in the prospects of the president handing the ball to the Knesset itself and finding another member of the Israeli parliament to try to come up with some kind of a coalition of their own. And around the same time, making all that even more febrile, could be the decision by the Attorney General as to whether or not to indict Netanyahu in 3 separate corruption cases. The best prospects that seem to be available to him would be that one of the charges, the most serious, bribery, is downgraded, potentially enabling him to convince people to get together into a unity administration, or at the very least buttressing his position against a legal challenge to his premiership in the run-up to what could be a third election in less than a year. Harry Fawcett for Inside Story, West Jerusalem.
Let's bring in our guests in Tel Aviv. Dahlia Scheindlin, a public opinion expert and political analyst, joining us on Skype from Akron, northern Israel. Jamal, a Palestinian intellectual and professor of political science at Tel Aviv University. And in West Jerusalem, Hoffman, chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post and a Knesset insider. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Dahlia, I'm going to start with you. Are you surprised that Benjamin Netanyahu has found himself in this position?
I'm not at all surprised, because it was fairly clear from the outset that Netanyahu had no easy path to creating a coalition, especially I think when he formed this bloc of parties and basically got all the right-wing parties to agree to negotiate as a bloc, as a single unit. That was something the other parties didn't really count on. There was never any real reason why other parties, especially blue and white, would agree to go into negotiations on those terms. And so he never had an easy path to forming a government. That's in the short term. And in the long term, I'm not entirely surprised because, after all, he didn't win the elections. His party came in second, of course, by only one seat, but it is part of what looks to be somewhat declining fortunes for Netanyahu after a very long time as prime minister. His party alone lost about 29,000 votes between the April and September elections. And if you add on the potential votes that he could have had once his party incorporated another small party called Kulanu, he could theoretically have had 39 seats, and he ended at 32. And so something is, not going well for his voters. They're starting, many of his voters, or potential voters, are starting to think it's time for the beginning of the end. That's compounded by him being in power for so long, and of course the encroaching legal charges. And I think just the sense, of many people that the Likud maybe doesn't need their votes. That's what I heard some voters say. All of these things combined meant that he had a weaker showing this time.
So, because you're a public opinion expert, I want to put this to you. You kind of touched on a little bit. What do you know that was driving the voters this time?
The first tier of decision-making for the Israeli voter is their self-identification in terms of ideology. When people define themselves as right, left, or center in Israel, that is the best predictor for which kind of party they'll vote for. So if a person says, I'm right-wing, very high chances that person is going to vote for a right-wing party. We don't necessarily know which party. And that ideology is a whole worldview. It's not just a slogan. And that worldview doesn't change overnight or even necessarily from election to election. And so, we often say this election is about Netanyahu. We said it in September, we said it in April. But Netanyahu represents a right-wing worldview for the right-wing voters. They're about 50% of the adult population. And only about 42%, so somewhat less, are either centrist, maybe 25%, and left-wing, who are about 20%. That's the reason why people will vote for a center or a left-wing party if they identify as center or left-wing. Those things essentially break down based on attitudes towards security and the conflict before anything else. And only after that do we see people expressing their feelings about things like corruption or economic issues or rule of law or any other issue that plagues any society. But first of all, it's ideology, and ideology is first of all around issues of security and the conflict. That's almost always the case. Okay. And of course, religion and state is the other, I would say, second main issue that divides the ideological voters.
Okay. Amal, how would you say Benjamin Netanyahu exploits those categories, those divisions that Dahlia just broke down for us?
Well, he managed to do that very well for a long time. Since 2009, he managed to build a coalition. I think his power is waning not because of ideological change, but actually because of the legal charges he's facing now, and that everybody knows, even in his own party, that he's doing everything in order to save himself on the personal level, and that's why, as Dahlia said, he lost a lot of his power in the last election, September elections. And I think the fact that he was not able to build a coalition and he had to hand in the power back to the president means that we began actually a new period in Israeli politics, the post-Netanyahu age, I think, in Israeli politics.
So, Gil, what of that? What is really the psychological impact? When I was preparing for this broadcast today, I saw several authors that specifically used that word psychological, the psychological impact of this potentially being the end for Benjamin Netanyahu. How do you see that? What's your analysis of that?
So Israel's been controlled by Netanyahu now for more than a decade, but 3 years earlier as well. And there are a lot of people who don't remember anybody else being in power. They don't remember somebody else being given a chance to even form a government. And they have to realize that life goes on, that we were around for a long time without him, and it will be have to move on to somebody else who doesn't have the kind of experience that Netanyahu did. Israel is a country where people really value experience in a politician, and there's no one alive today who has the experience that Netanyahu does politically. And so we're going to have to deal with having a less experienced leader at a time where we're facing significant security challenges, especially after Donald Trump's decisions that he made about Syria. And Netanyahu has been either brainwashing or using remarkable persuasive abilities, depending if you look at it negatively or positively, the people of Israel for many years that he and only he can make them feel safe. And that's why people would indeed need to make a psychological adjustment to having somebody else in power. And that's especially among the people who are the people most loyal to Netanyahu, who will have to accept that the person who they've come to worship in one way or another won't be there anymore. And the reason that he won't be there anymore is because not of competition, really, but because of his own mistakes that brought himself down.
Dahlia, you had said that you think that Netanyahu might be willing to sacrifice some of his coalition, right? I think he's got 55 members in his bloc to retain his position. How so? Why do you think that?
Well, I'm not sure if he'd be willing to sacrifice them, but members of the bloc on some level might be willing to peel off. One of the possible scenarios, and there are so many scenarios at play here, is that blue and white is trying to form a government. I don't think anybody really prefers the idea of a minority government with the joint list supporting from outside. That's politically very sensitive. I'm sure that blue and white will try to tempt some of those parties from the right-wing bloc to peel off. When it comes to Netanyahu's own decision-making, my thinking is that he has two major demands that he seems to have really wanted to achieve, which are the conditions that he set when he was supposed to form the government. One is to keep this big block of right-wing parties together, and the other is that he continue being prime minister, preferably first, if there is a rotation. My thinking is that if he has to give up on one of those, I imagine that he would be more likely to give up on the right-wing bloc if he gets something that, acceptable in his terms regarding how he can continue to be prime minister despite the fact that the legal challenges are closing in around him. It's the kind of thing that the president himself, Reuven Rivlin, proposed to the parties when Netanyahu was supposed to have the mandate, when Netanyahu had the mandate to form the government, and blue and white didn't seem to want to negotiate about that. The reason might simply be that blue and white, held the perspective of, we won the elections, we might eventually reach this kind of compromise, but on our terms. So maybe they were just waiting for the mandate to come to them so that they could reach some similar kind of compromise that it would involve Netanyahu agreeing to split that bloc in return for some fairly comfortable situation with regards to continuing to be prime minister, even during the legal proceedings. But this is a lot of speculation. There are many, many political elites who have to make unpredictable decisions here.
Okay. Gil, Dahlia mentioned this idea that perhaps there would be some sort of rotation of power. How likely do you think a scenario like that is? How would that actually work?
Extremely likely. In fact, there's not really another choice at all. We're not going to a third election. It's not going to happen. The people of Israel will not let it happen. Our economy can't sustain that. There's too many decisions that have been on hold now since last December. And so a unity government is really all there is. They're going to have to swallow their pride and break campaign promises, which is not easy, and run the country together. The president gave a compromise that I know people in blue and white told me initially that they would want to accept. They just didn't want to accept it immediately. Their tactic was to accept it later on. So that's what's going to happen. But nobody in Israel does anything way before a deadline. The deadline's going to be December 11th or 12th. And here we are sitting in the middle of October still. We've got a long way to go.
Amal, how much leverage do the Arab parties have right now?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that it's a new reality. The center left parties need the Arab parties in order to build a coalition. And the willingness of the joint list to join, at least from the outside, to support such a government is on the rise. There's a majority within the joint list that are for supporting such a coalition. I think this creates a very good opportunity to have a great impact. And the last elections have shown very well. I mean, the comparison between April, what happened in April and what happened in September shows very much that the Arab citizens would like the joint list to be there and to be a very active player and to actually play according to the rules of the game in order to promote the interests of the Arab community and to have an impact on Israeli politics. I think the joint list understands very much the situation. When you hear Ayman Odeh or Ahmad Tibi speaking about it, you see that they understand that it's a very good historical opportunity either to support a minimal coalition from the outside in order at least to get rid of Netanyahu, or to become the head of the opposition within the parliament, which is also a great gain that gives them a new platform in order to practice their power. I think this is very well known also to Kahol Lavan, to Blue and White. And Blue and White is trying to maneuver between vis-a-vis, of course, the right-wing parties who became part of the bloc of Netanyahu's bloc. Blue and White are maneuvering and trying to use the joint list in order to force right-wing parties to break away from Netanyahu and join the coalition.
Okay.
So we'll have to wait and see what happens in the next few days.
Dahlia, tell us more about the spike in voter turnout for Arabs in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, ever since the history of the state, the Arab citizens have participated in voting, oftentimes under duress because they were living under a military government until 1966. But after that, they continued to vote at a very high rate, close to the Jewish vote. What happened was when the Intifada broke out in 2001, the second Intifada at the end of 2000, and then special elections were held for 2001, after 13 Arab citizens had been killed in a protest, there was a general boycott, and only 18% participated in those special elections for prime minister. That legitimized the idea of boycotting. And ever since then, turnout among the Arab citizens has never been as high as it is for the Jewish vote. It has hovered around the halfway mark. It went up when the joint list was formed a couple of cycles ago to just over 60%, still lower than the Jewish vote, reflecting a general worsening of relations and increase of tensions between the Arab and Jewish populations, or I shouldn't even say the populations, but on the political level in terms of a government that has been very aggressive in its approach to the Arab minority in Israel, Palestinian citizens. When the joint list reconstituted itself in time for the September elections, meaning several Arab parties came back together after they had broken up before the April elections, that led to a surge of support. So in the April elections, only about 50%, 49% of the Arab population voted. And then in September, that rose by about 10 points to close to 60%. That reflected a belief in the need for those parties to reconvene as one bloc. But I think it also reflected the sense that they were not satisfied with what they had done in April in not participating fully and having a poor turnout or poor showing, I should say, poor results of only about 10 seats. I think the community and the political leaders came together with a much more unified message, as Amal said, that the leadership understands how much the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel want their political parties to participate in the electoral system, in the government, in the governing system, and maybe even in the government itself, and support greater integration into Israel's political institutions. And they really ran making that a part of the debate, making statements during the campaign that they would consider being part of a government. That was much more in tune with the public opinion among the Arab Palestinian citizens. We know this from fairly consistent and extensive polling showing very high support, as Amal pointed out. And those things together, I think, combined with, again, a very aggressive negative campaign by the Likud and Netanyahu himself against the participation of Arab citizens, almost blaming them before the elections for preparing to steal the elections, in many ways delegitimizing their participation in the political system, led to an additional layer of defiance that said, not only do we want to be integrated into the political system, we reject the fact that you're trying to keep us out.
Gil, I saw you nodding through.
And that, of course, led to a strong result with 13 seats.
Okay. Gil, I saw you nodding through some of what Dahlia was saying. Did you want to add something to that?
Well, Dahlia's analysis is brilliant, but in the end, the politicians make the decisions. And Benny Gantz can't make himself look too close to the Arab population, or he'll lose his potential of getting a right-wing party to jump out of the 55 and enable him to form a government, and also make it harder for him to eventually woo the Likud if Netanyahu indeed gets harmed by the charges that are going to be officially indicting him during Gantz's 28 days that he has to form a government. There needs to be an effort right then, when Gantz still has the exclusive ability to form a government, to get the Likud to oust Netanyahu, which is not going to be easy to do. So even though there was a report this morning that Gantz is going to be negotiating with the joint list of Arab Knesset members, it's not going to happen. He's going to meet with them cordially, but those will not be negotiations. And what Amal said about them becoming opposition leader, that's not going to happen either. Even if they end up being the largest faction that isn't part of the government, it doesn't automatically go to the largest faction. All the parties that would remain outside would unite together behind the Jewish candidate. So little by little, the Arab population has moved forward during this election because of decisions that Ayman Odeh, the leader of the joint list, has made. But you can't bite off more than you can chew right now.
So as we've said, there are many scenarios, but Gil, you've been clear that there's not going to be a third election as you see it. Amal, do you agree with that too, that this will get sorted out?
Well, at some point, yes. I think nobody wants to go for third elections now. Most of the parties actually won what they wanted. I mean, Lieberman wanted actually to enlarge to enlarge his party in the parliament. He forced the last elections, and I think he has no interest to go for another elections. I think the joint list the same, the ultra-Orthodox party is the same. And therefore, I think the opportunity that Kahol Lavan, blue and white, have now is a historic opportunity to try to maneuver, as I said before, between the Arab Party, the joint list, and the right-wing parties in order to enforce a new reality, a new coalition. And I think we have to take into consideration that at some point, there has to happen something in the Likud in order to tell Netanyahu, to show Netanyahu the way out. Without that, I think a big coalition cannot happen, and the risk for going for the third election, I think, will have its own impact on the dynamics that both big parties have in the coming few days.
Dahlia, how much were these corruption charges, this indictment, on the minds of voters? How has that affected all of this?
Well, there's two layers here, and I just want to, I deeply respect my colleagues' analysis, but I think we need to leave open a slightly bigger option for the possibility of a third election. I'm not happy to be saying it, but at this point, I would have expected the political leaders to be showing some cracks in the armor of these very zero-sum promises, and so far they are not. And if they keep sticking to their guns, so to speak, Lieberman is even digging in and saying, I won't even go into a coalition practically with Democratic Union, another small left-wing party. So something has to give if we are to avoid these third elections. I'll just put that out there. And, in terms of the question about...
the corruption.
Remind me of the question.
The corruption indictment.
Corruption charges. Yes, I was trying to stifle it. I was trying to stifle the question because there's no good answer. I can tell you that from the perspective of the political elites, I think it's weighing very heavily. I think that the leaders of blue and white are saying, let's play out the time that we have, because the more time we leave to get this coalition formation done, the closer we get to the possibility of a decision from the Attorney General about an indictment, or more than one indictment, which is supposed to happen sometime in mid-December or late December. And I think the more they are probably banking on that happening around the time when there's really significant pressure because the mandate is about to run out. Okay. And that putting, again, psychological pressure for Netanyahu to compromise. However, in the voters' minds, I have to add that this is still a very divisive issue. A large portion of the right-wing voters believe these charges are essentially trumped up, so to speak, not very serious, probably could apply to any politician, and are some sort of collusion/conspiracy on the part of shadowy, unelected, legal media and other left-wing operatives to get Netanyahu out because of some sort of personal vendetta against him. And for that reason, it doesn't necessarily impact their vote that much.
That will be the last word. I think that will be the last word there. And thank you to all of you for joining us to discuss this. I'm sure we'll be discussing it again within the next 28 days for sure. Dahlia, Scheindlin, Amal, Jamal, and Gil Hoffman. Thank you all very much. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Visit our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.